Dr. Lane, welcome. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks. So this book centers around the Office of the Territorial Engineer, which is like the precursor to the state engineer, and the role of courts and judges in moving water away from the people who lived here and toward and into the control of Anglos. And so I want to talk about this idea because even here on the show all the time, we talk about water management as though it's kind of this neutral term, but in fact, it's not really neutral. How did, as you write in your book, water management provide the keystone for a broader structure of dispossession?
Yeah, so in this book, which is a historical geography, so focusing on both how things change in time and in space, looking at specifically at changes that happened in how water was managed in New Mexico. What I'm really trying to focus on is these points of change, right? The transition that happened. And transitions can happen quickly in the imposition of a new policy or law, but they also can happen slowly in terms of how people think about water management or think about what's right or think about whether they should follow the policy or not follow the policy. And so I'm really interested in the complexity of how these changes happen. And we know that New Mexico has a long history of coloniality, that we have different waves of colonizers who come into this region and take control over territory and resources from people who pre-existed them. And I am trying to show that water management was a really important part of how this colonization happened when it comes to the Anglo wave of colonization, which happened after this region became part of the United States territory. So starting in the late 1800s and then getting up to the point where my book really focuses the turn of the century and up leading up until statehood, water management became a tool of taking territory and taking not just territory, but control of decision-making over resources. And it was done in a really specific way. And I try to get a lot into the details of the policy and the implementation in the book. But to show that that was part of dispossession. It wasn't just like, hey, here's some great new methods for how we could be more efficient with our water use. It was really about saying this form of knowledge about water is no longer valued. And this new form of scientific knowledge is going to be valued. And we're only going to care about the things we can measure with this new form of knowledge. And that gives us a new system and it gives us a new future, really, from that point forward to now, that dispossessed certain people and empowered certain other people and isn't neutral.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm really struck by with your research and this book and multiple examples throughout this book is how irrigation engineers are all about efficiency, and Anglo water users were by and large unfamiliar with the landscape. And there are a lot of examples of how they're extremely inefficient. And yet that knowledge of Anglos was given a higher priority by judges and courts. How did that play out historically, and how does the impacts of that play out today still?
Yeah, so I do have an entire chapter on expertise and the construction of kind of the idea of expertise over water. And I think it is really interesting that expertise became synonymous with a kind of person, right? It's like expertise is constructed as a personal characteristic, not as like some objective measurement. It's like these people are experts and these people are not experts. And so that was Anglo white people were experts and non-Anglo, non-white people were not experts. And where that comes from is a political philosophy of progressivism, capital P, Progressive Party, turn of the century, was all about efficiency and rational management of resources, which brought us a lot of things that we really value and still value today, including the national forests and the national parks and all this idea of setting aside land and managing it really rationally so that everyone would benefit and it wouldn't just be used up. But it introduces something that I think is really problematic, and I really try to explore in this book, which is this idea that we can only make decisions on this rational basis. Otherwise, they're bad decisions. And so people who have mathematics training or people who have hydrologic training are considered like the new experts in water management. And the unbelievable thing that's unrecognized, at least in this time and in the historical record, is that you have land-based people living in this region with generations and generations and generations of knowledge passed down about environmental conditions, environmental change, water flow, water use, water management, and they're no longer experts because the new experts have to have degrees in hydrology or degrees in forestry or degrees in math or whatever. And that's a really, like, on the face of it, looking back, it's like, really, these people coming in are the ones who knew absolutely nothing about this region or about water. And most of them were Easterners from the Eastern U.S. and didn't personally understand arid conditions like these generational residents did. So what an interesting irony, right? That expertise gets constructed based on this progressive political philosophy as being the educated white people from the East who were in fact coming into a landscape that they knew nothing about and had high levels of ignorance. And the first territorial engineer, irrigation engineer, was writing in his reports annually to the governor, like, our big problem is these new people coming from the East are totally wasting water. They have no idea what they're doing. They were writing about how ignorant people were and saying white people alone had the expertise to manage water, which was just how people understood things at that time without really addressing the racism that lays behind it.
Right. So this book is based on incredible historical research, including court records. Why were you looking at court records, and what did they show?
Yeah, so I was interested in, like, how did policy change, but also how did it affect people's daily lives? And when we're looking at trying to understand people's daily life, people who might be out on the land using water or making a decision about, should I irrigate this field or not irrigate this field, or how should I handle the fact that a flood just came through and this orchard that I just planted is at risk? There's not a lot of documentary records to help us understand that. So I can go and get all the Office of the Engineer, I can go and get all their reports. I can look at all the reports of the governor to the Department of Interior. I can get all the official reports and learn a lot about how they thought about knowledge and what were their goals, policy-wise and management-wise at that time. But I can't find, there's no book of reports on, this farmer or that farmer. And so court records felt to me like a way of accessing individual stories. And so I went and pulled, looking at all the counties along the Rio Chama, Rio Grande extent in New Mexico, and the county boundaries were different then, of course. But I looked at the 12 years before statehood, so 1900 to 1912, went through all those counties and pulled every single court case that had anything to do with water at the district court, which would have been at that time the lowest level court that would have heard a water dispute. As an effort to get as close as possible to some of those individual stories and histories. Now, it's not a complete record, right? Because you and I could have a water dispute and never have a court claim over it. And it never went into any kind of record. And maybe we did have a water dispute, it went into the record, and I got it out of the archives and I read it, but a lot of documents were missing, including maybe the final resolution. So it is an incomplete source, but it's a way of getting at those individual stories and understanding really what were the pain points, or how were people thinking about what was the right way to think about water, to think about environmental change. We can read a lot of that in the court records, so that's why I went to those. And in the end, that was about 180 court cases from that region, from that time period, which is a pretty robust record, I think.
So your book is not prescriptive, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on who should read this book, or who you hope reads this book, and what are some of the lessons we really need to be thinking about right now?
Well, I think this book should be read by people who are just students of New Mexico history and people who aren't looking for easy solutions, because there are no solutions proposed in this book, and in my personal opinion, easy solutions are always false solutions. I mean, this book is just telling a story of how complex the conditions are that give rise to certain policies. And if we go back and look at how did this actual policy develop, we can see every step of the way. If we look at it really, we can see the specific language, the specific knowledge, the specific policy elements that produced something at a certain time. But there could have been other options at that time. It could have gone a different direction. It didn't. And so, we end up on the path that leads us to today. But I think it's hopeful to think about how could things have gone differently and to really understand why did they go this way, because then that helps us think about how we might do things differently in the future. So I'm not a policy analyst, and I am not going to give a judgment on, who should be in charge of water or how should we manage water. But I really think the lesson that I learned and that I'm trying to impart to readers is that if we take a single policy or a single approach, like scientific knowledge or engineering policy, for example, as the way we're going to create perfect water management, we will be wrong. I think what I see from all of these stories in this book is that we have to really think broadly about how can different forms of knowledge come together. How could we create an environmental future that wasn't dispossessive based on a specific policy that excluded the expertise of an entire racial or ethnic group of people? That we could do that. In the past, we didn't, but I think it's hopeful to think about how there's nothing set in stone about these past choices. So I hope a lot of people will read it. It's got a lot of dense historical detail, but also some really interesting stories, and I think adds a lot to our historical understanding of New Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that lots of water managers and students, and I really appreciate the work in this book, and I am thankful that you're on the show today. So Dr. Lane, thank you.
Thank you.